All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Discouraging Avian Feeding. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Hannah Allen, and I am a planner with the Environment and Development Department of the
I don't know why that's not going.
Central Texas Council of Governments. So to get started, NCTCOG is a voluntary association of local governments. We are just one of 24 COGs in Texas, and our main function is to transcend jurisdictional boundaries to promote sound development and facilitate cooperation among member governments. As part of our TMDL program with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, we host these workshops and/or webinars on water quality topics specifically relating to bacterial issues. So bacteria impairments in the DFW Metroplex can be caused by many factors, including but not limited to pet waste, sanitary sewer overflows, illicit discharges, as well as wildlife waste. You can view a total maximum daily load like a budget for a pollutant, and in our case, the pollutant we are concerned with is E. coli. There are 23 impaired segments in the TMDL I-Plan project area listed on this slide. These segments are cataloged in the implementation for 23 total maximum daily loads for bacteria in the Greater Trinity River region. This I-Plan includes BMP examples, goals for education and outreach, as well as technical information on each of the impaired segments. This I-Plan was recently updated in 2020 to incorporate the North Fork Fish Creek Addendum, other roster updates, and minor administrative items. This I-Plan is also now ADA compliant and is available for download and review online at www.nctcog.org/TMDL. And that link will be provided not only in the follow-up email, but also at the end of these slides. And we'll get started today. Our first presentation is from Rachel Richter, an urban wildlife biologist with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department in DFW. Rachel has a bachelor's degree in wildlife and fishery science from Texas A&M and a master's degree in wildlife ecology from Texas State. As an urban wildlife biologist, she focuses on making our communities more wildlife friendly through educational outreach and providing technical guidance. Okay, Rachel, I'm going to pass controls over to you.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in this morning. Obviously, we're here this morning to talk about ducks and why feeding them is bad. So I'm going to kind of start with the kind of overview of what this does to the duck population and what it also does to the ecosystem. So we have made duck feeding a really kind of commonplace activity. Most of us on this call have probably done it at some point. I know I definitely did it as a kid, and it's just kind of one of those things that we think of as like a fun, harmless activity that, doesn't, that this is what you do. You go out and give bread to ducks. But the problem is it has a lot of serious implications, not just for the ducks, but also for the entire ecosystem and our water quality as well. One of the problems is this is the type of stuff that we are typically feeding ducks, right? It's junk food. It's not food that is healthy for them. And you may kind of think, what's the big deal? I went out and I gave the ducks a few slices of bread. They quacked at me, they wagged their tails, and I went on my way. But I encourage you sometime to go to a park where you know that people are pretty actively feeding the ducks and just sit and watch for a little while, because it is really mind-boggling how this can be a really like constant stream of people kind of coming in and feeding the ducks various things. And the problem with that, of course, is that this does not at all resemble what the natural diet of the duck should be. So these are just some examples of the diverse things that a duck would naturally have in its diet. So things like aquatic plants and algae, mollusks, small fish, worms. This varied diet is how the ducks get the nutrients that they need in order to survive and to support their system. And so people food is just not healthy for wildlife. And when you have a constant stream of people coming in and providing food to these animals, they become reliant on that food and they might ignore their natural food sources. Or in some cases, that food, like something like bread, as if it floats in the water for a while or as it sits in their stomach, it's going to expand. So it kind of gives them an artificial feeling of being full, so they don't go out and search for their natural food sources. Basically, when that's all they eat is that junk food, it can cause serious problems for their health. So this picture, for example, this is not a duck that is like happily running towards you, waving its wings at you. This is a duck that has a condition known as angel wing that is caused from malnutrition. And basically, angel wing causes the wrist joint of the duck's wing to rotate outwards, and the duck cannot lay its wings flat against its body. Another issue that ducks can get is metabolic bone disease, which basically makes their bones really soft, and it can cause deformities as they grow. Their bones are easily broken, and they can also lose the ability to fly. Also, if people are feeding ducks old, being moldy, or if that bread has the chance to sit out for a little while because there's so much out there that they don't eat it all the way right away, that mold that grows on the bread can actually give ducks a fungal infection known as aspergillosis, which can cause issues. Also, when we feed wildlife, to artificially inflate the population because individuals are drawn to that area and it causes them to occur at higher densities than they would naturally. And so basically, when you have more individuals in an area, you're going to have more contact between the individuals, and it's going to increase the risk for disease spread, right? Because they're not properly socially distanced, and they're coming into contact with each other more than they normally would. And so if one of those individuals is sick, it can very easily spread through the population. One example of disease in ducks that we're worried about with this is called duck plague or viral enteritis. And that is a gastrointestinal disease that kills ducks pretty quickly, and it has a very high mortality rate. And some species of duck are more susceptible to this than others. So for example, Muscovy ducks, which are the kind of black, white, and red ducks, they are very susceptible to it. And it's not terribly uncommon here in DFW for ponds where people are feeding ducks to have outbreaks of this disease, and they'll end up with a lot of dead ducks over a short period of time. So duck plague can be spread from ducks having contact with each other, but it can also get into the water and be contracted by other ducks from the water. And so this is a big concern when you think about our native migratory duck species. They're not as susceptible to it as the Muscovy ducks, but if you have ducks in a water body that are shedding that virus into the water body, then it's possible that our native ducks could get into there and contract it, or at least pick it up and move it from location to location when they migrate. So this is something that we really don't want to get into our native waterfowl population. Another issue with feeding animals is that when we give them food, we are teaching them not to be afraid of us. And that's basically what we refer to as habituation. And so when animals lose their fear of humans and we're feeding them, they learn to recognize us as a food source, and they think it's a good idea to be next to us all the time, which can lead to a lot of conflict between people and wildlife. So, for example, some ducks and geese, they might lose that instinct to migrate. If they have plentiful food provided for them by humans, they can actually not follow their natural migration patterns. This can also result in birds becoming aggressive. We all have probably at one point or another experienced like a particularly nasty goose at a local park that chased us or something like that. And, if it's just one or two geese with an attitude, that may not seem like that big of a deal. But if you get them, and people in DFW have dealt with this before, where you have large populations of animals that are hanging out near buildings and actually attacking people as they enter and leave. That's a pretty big scale problem to have to tackle. You also end up with basically the birds are in areas that is not good for them to be. So I get a lot of calls every year from people who have ducks that have decided to make their nest in a really like not smart location, and the property owners are wondering what their options are for dealing with this duck now, or the ducklings after they've hatched. We also get ducks that tend to start hanging out in things like pools. I have worked with HOAs that have had to close down their pool because basically the ducks took it over and they couldn't keep the environment sanitary enough to leave it open for swimming. So they basically just had to say, this is the ducks pool for this year and we'll try again next year. So these are all negative consequences that can happen when these birds get too comfortable with being around people. Also, it's really important to keep in mind that most of the ducks that we see in large numbers at ponds where they are being fed are invasive species. So these are species that are actually not native to Texas. So a lot of them are feral ducks. So these are domestic ducks that have become feral, or hybrids of those feral ducks with our native duck species. So for example, the ducks that kind of have these like weird inconsistent splotchy markings, a lot of those are domestic ducks that have hybridized with native ducks. And this is problematic from a standpoint of conservation for our native waterfowl species. And if you look at this guy right here, it's kind of hard to tell, but this is another example of a deformity. This guy has, its bill is crossed, so it can't open and close its bill properly. It's just, it's offset and crossed. So it's just important to keep in mind that these species these birds that we are subsidizing in our watershed are usually not birds that have a place in that watershed to begin with. So these are birds that are not a part of our natural ecosystems. And it's also really important to keep in mind that when you are feeding wildlife, when you are putting food out there into the environment, you are very likely to be attracting other species than the one you are trying to feed. So when people are feeding ducks and geese, a lot of times not all of that food is going to be eaten up right away, or other critters may just come in and snatch it before the ducks have the chance to. And so there's lots of other wildlife out there that is willing to capitalize on the food that's being left out there for ducks. And sometimes they may be coming in for food for the leftover people food directly, or they might be coming in to eat something that is coming in to eat the duck food, right? So for example, mice will definitely come in and eat scraps, and they are a primary food source for coyotes and bobcats. And I have worked with communities before that have had issues at parks where maybe they've got some coyotes that are starting to display some non-desirable behaviors. And after spending some time in that park and watching, they realized that the coyotes were taking advantage of the food that people were putting out for ducks. And also sometimes people were there to feed the ducks, and then they toss a slice or two of bread to the coyote that was hanging out. So these are, that's just one kind of unforeseen consequence that can happen when you're feeding wildlife. Another big problem is habitat degradation. And so when we've already kind of talked about how when you feed these animals, you cause them to become overpopulated and occur at greater densities than they would. And oftentimes it can get to the point where it's so much that the habitat that is there, the ecosystem cannot support that level of population. And so what can happen is either through direct consumption or through trampling. What can happen is the ducks can actually get rid of all of the vegetation that is around the water body. And so what happens in a situation like this, as y'all know, Vegetation is super important around a water body because the plants have nice deep roots that hold the soil in place and prevent erosion and improve water quality. And so when you lose all of that vegetation, the bank becomes destabilized, and all of this dirt is going to basically run into the water body, which can create increased sedimentation and impact water quality in your watershed. And so launching off from that, there's lots of ways that duck feeding can impact your water quality. So for one, if people are throwing a lot of stuff in there, and again, it's not going to all get eaten, that rotting bread and everything else, all that stuff just stays in the water, and it's not good for the water quality. And it can also clog up things like fountains and cause costly repairs. The other big issue is that these birds, ducks and geese have fairly fast metabolisms, which means they're going to eat a lot, and they also tend to excrete a lot. So when you have duck poop that is kind of everywhere around your pond or lake, it's not just gross. It can also be really expensive to have to pressure spray all of those hardscapes, but also all of that poop is eventually going to find its way into the water body, which is a problem for bacteria, which I know, we are certainly of concern about today, and Mark's going to talk a little bit more about that. But it's a big problem for bacteria, which might impact your ability to use that water body in the way that you want to. So you might not be able to swim in it, fish, if that water body becomes listed as impaired. Also, all of those nutrients from the poop find their way into the water, and that can lead to an imbalance in the nutrient levels within the water body, which can cause eutrophication, which can lead to algal blooms and fish kills. And so it just kind of shows you, in an ecosystem, everything is connected. So if you do something that you think might only be having an impact on one component, one member of that ecosystem, which are the ducks in this case, it's going to also impact everything else. And the impacts of what happens to the duck population are going to cascade across the entire ecosystem and impact species that we are not intending to have an impact on, and it also can cause serious problems to our water quality. So if you think you have a problem in your community, what can you do to turn things around? Well, outreach and education are going to be a really important first step. As we kind of talked about at the beginning, this is a common activity, and most people who are doing it have good intentions. They think that they are doing something fun that's good for the ducks, and they don't realize the harm that it is causing. So just taking those first steps to get out and teach people that this is a problem and not something that they should be doing is really important. And so there are a few different ways that y'all could do that. Putting out signs is a good example. I've got a few examples here. You can also put stuff on social media. I believe COG has some resources for that. And you can also host presentations of the community, or set up a booth at the local pond and hand out flyers and tell people, hey, we're trying not to feed ducks anymore, and this is why. I also recommend that you get a feeding ordinance in place if your community doesn't already have one. There are no state level regulations that address feeding wildlife, so it is really up to the local community to decide how they want to regulate that and to put those ordinances into place. So if you don't currently have a feeding ordinance and you're considering creating one, I recommend that you don't just focus it on ducks, but you get a blanket feeding ordinance for all wildlife. And you can put exceptions in there for things like bird feeders in someone's yard or something like that that is benign. But the reason why I recommend that you cover all wildlife is that way, ducks may be your problem right now, but 5 years from now, if you've got some person who's doing something nuts, like putting out feeding troughs for feral hogs or something, if you have that feeding ordinance in place, you've got something to kind of back you up when you're trying to tell that person no. So feeding ordinances can be a good tool to controlling people feeding ducks in your community. One question that I frequently get asked is, what about healthy food? So we get it, potato chips are not great for ducks. What can we feed them instead? And the internet is full of stuff talking about like, hey, bread is bad for me. Please feed me other things instead. So there's kind of this idea getting around that it's bad to feed ducks bread, but okay to feed them other stuff. And my standpoint on this is no, you shouldn't be feeding the ducks anything. And the reason for that is if you're feeding them healthier foods, that might help, at least in the short term, the health of the individual duck. So you might see fewer instances of angel wing, for example, but it's not going to do anything to prevent all of the other negative consequences that we have from feeding ducks. So it's not going to help with overpopulation. It's not going to help with the habitat degradation. It's not situation, and it's definitely not going to help with the water quality. So it's really best to recommend no feeding at all, even if you're feeding foods that may have a little bit more nutritional value. So your other options for managing ducks, and this section is going to apply specifically to non-native waterfowl, because non-native waterfowl are not protected under state law, and they're not protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act because they're not native to Texas, so they don't get that same level of protection that our native ducks and geese have. So what you can do is you can oil eggs, which is basically you coat them in cooking oil, or you can addle the eggs, which is basically you pick them up and shake them. And both of these things prevent the embryo inside from developing. And what you do after you treat the eggs, you put them back in the nest. And it's really important to put them back in the nest because if you take the eggs away, that will trigger the bird to nest again. But if the eggs remain in the nest, then the bird doesn't realize that they are not viable and will continue sitting on the nest. You can also trap and remove the ducks, the non-native ducks and geese. And I recommend, in the instance of trapping, I do recommend that the birds are not relocated. And the reason for that is there is not a good place to release them, right? Like there's not a natural area in Texas where these birds belong because they are invasive species. And if you relocate them, they're only going to cause the same level of damage at the new location that they were causing at the original location. So in a way, you're just moving the problem somewhere else. The good thing about trapping and removing the birds is that this is the only option that provides immediate relief to that water body. Because with all of the other options, it's going to be a much more gradual decline. So if you have a serious situation where, there's no vegetation left, the pond is impaired, you're concerned about disease spread, all that stuff, it's really best to just trap the ducks and get them out of there as soon as possible. Because, for example, things like if you're oiling and addling the eggs, that will slow their reproductive rate, but it's not going to do anything to get rid of the ducks that are currently there causing damage. So it will have an impact, but it will be a more gradual impact. And then kind of the same thing with the outreach and the feeding. Those things have an impact. It's definitely good if you can stop getting food put into the environment, and that will help with habituation, and that will help with water quality decline from the kind of rotting food in the water body, and it might cause the ducks and geese to disperse from that area. So that still has an impact, but again, it's going to be a much more gradual improvement than if you were to just immediately remove the ducks from the area. So a lot of people will look at this as like, wait, you're taking away how I get outside and how I experience nature. So it's a good idea, as part of your outreach to the community, include some alternatives for them to do. Maybe instead of going and feeding the ducks, they go and take a set of binoculars or their camera along and just observe the ducks. You can still see the ducks, you can still experience the ducks without feeding them. And maybe they can contribute to a citizen science project like iNaturalist or eBird, where they can upload their observations of these ducks and share it with the world. And those things can be used by actual scientists to go and make determinations about wildlife populations across the world. And also, if these are people that are generally trying to do good things for wildlife and the environment, so maybe they could take on projects that will actually work to improve their local parks, like a trash pickup or planting some native plants. And overall, I think it's important with your messaging and with your management strategies to focus on, instead of managing for one specific species, let's focus on promoting healthy habitats that have diverse species, have lots of great plants, native vegetation, that something like this is going to be much more diverse and much more stable and more supporting of life overall than if we're just making a pond where people go and feed ducks. And this is healthy functioning ecosystems are also critical to having good water quality, which is so important for the bodies of water that we're going to be maybe drinking from or recreating in. So really promoting that healthy habitat. We're not feeding the ducks because it's enabling us to do all of these great things for the pond as a whole. And with that, I will be glad to answer any questions that y'all might have.
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, we have a question. Are there any cities or counties in which I can find example feeding ordinances? And that is a great question. We actually have Mark Enders from the City of New Braunfels that has a feeding ordinance that he will be discussing. So that is one that we are aware of. We attempted to find a local presentation. I know that the City of Bedford and the City of Addison both have no feeding ordinances, but they were unable to speak today. Rachel, do you know of any others that are great examples of no feeding ordinances?
Yeah, so I think locally Addison has one, and I'm sure that there are more. Richardson, I'm not sure if they have a feeding ordinance, but they do have some good information on their website about feeding ducks. And the Colony, I believe, also has a feeding ordinance, and I'm sure that there are more, but I might have some documents that have the text of some local feeding ordinances that I can send you after the webinar, Hannah, if you want to send that out to folks.
That would be great. We would love to include that in the follow-up email. Okay, we have another question. If you trap and remove the ducks, does the entity have to contact Texas Parks and Wildlife for permission?
So if you are trapping and removing non-native ducks, you do not need any sort of permit or permission or anything like that. There are no regulations that are in place to protect them. So one thing that I forgot to mention, if you do go the trapping route or the egg destruction route, you need to make sure that the staff that is going to be doing it, they're going to need some training to make sure that they can identify native versus non-native ducks in nests, right? Because our native ducks do have legal protection, and it would not be good to trap our native duck species. But as long as it's non-native, you don't need any sort of special permissions.
All right, and we have a question from Cody. Are there any studies that show the correlation between avian feeding and an increase in E. coli?
I think Mark's got a good example coming up. And I think I might be able to find a document of it. I think that I might be able to find a document that can help, but I'm not sure if I have that PDF saved or not. So I'll see what I can find.
Great, thank you, Rachel.
Yeah.
All right, we'll go ahead and move on to Mark.
All righty, I'm here.
Awesome, we can hear you great. So I will go ahead and advance to this slide and let you get, well, actually, let me do your bio. So our second presentation today is from Mark Enders. He's the Watershed Program Manager with the City of New Braunfels, Texas. Mr. Enders graduated from Texas State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science with an emphasis in water policy and river management. After graduating, Mark began working with a water quality testing laboratory in Austin. He continued his professional career in the Lake Tahoe area, performing watershed management and water quality monitoring duties with an environmental consulting firm, Integrated Environmental Restoration Services. Mark moved back to Central Texas in 2011, where he continued to work in the field of water quality management with the San Antonio water system. Mark currently serves as the Watershed Program Manager for the City of New Braunfels, where he oversees the city's MS4 Stormwater Management Program, the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan, and local watershed protection initiatives. Overall, Mark has more than 13 years of experience working to protect water quality.
All righty. Thanks for the intro, Hannah. I appreciate it. And greetings to everyone from New Braunfels. Hope everyone is doing well this morning. Yeah, and Rachel, thank you for your presentation. I think that primes a lot of the information that I have here for you. I have helpful for your cause. So first, just a real quick background on New Braunfels. So New Braunfels is a town located pretty much smack dab in between Austin and San Antonio. It's located right on I-35. We're a town of about 85,000 folks, and we're growing rapidly, like a mini we're experiencing down here in New Braunfels. So why urban wildlife management in New Braunfels? The big driver for wildlife management is water quality concerns. I mean, Rachel talked a little bit about the water quality concerns, and I understand y'all have some bacteria impairments in y'all's neck of the woods and a implementation plan. So in New Braunfels, we have two water bodies, the Comal River and the Dry Comal Creek. The Dry Comal Creek has been impaired since 2010. And the Comal River itself was listed on the impaired water body listing in 2016 for the first time. And both of those water bodies are still on the impaired water body listing. The Comal River itself is highly recreated. We have, thousands of visitors that come to New Braunfels each year to tube and swim and float on the Comal. Impairment for bacteria and a lot of recreation activity. That was a huge concern that demanded a lot of attention from elected officials and city management because, again, we have that impairment with a lot of recreation activity that supports our recreation economy here in New Braunfels. So aside from the water quality concerns, certainly one stat that we tracked closely was the amount of deer and auto each year. And so my slide shows those numbers, but upwards, 500 to 700 deer auto collisions each year. So that was one stat that we tracked and then also presented to City Council and the public as we kind of wanted to move forward with wildlife management in New Braunfels. Lastly, but not least, was wildlife health. So I know Rachel mentioned a lot about, well, at least for the ducks and avian wildlife, that feeding human food to these animals, white-tailed deer, which we have very large and overabundant white-tailed deer populations. So whether it's in a city park where there's a lot of avian feeding or in residential neighborhoods where you have a lot of folks feeding corn to white-tailed deer, those food sources are not good for the wildlife themselves. So that was a concern that we had brought up and used as a stat or a point of why we need to move forward with some of these initiatives in New Braunfels. So starting off, again, we worked very closely with Texas Parks and Wildlife. I guess Rachel has a counterpart that's out of the San Antonio region. Her name was Jessica Alderson. I believe she has the same title as Rachel as an urban wildlife biologist. So when we were starting all this, we consulted pretty heavily with, and they did a handful of presentations for our city council and for the public at public workshops that we held. And so during those presentations, one of the key recommendations from Parks and Wildlife was, similarly to Rachel in her presentation, was pass a wildlife feeding ordinance, which will help, disperse populations of both white-tailed deer and avian wildlife. So ahead of the wildlife feeding ordinance that we council presentations, the council workshops for city council, and then we also did several public workshops on wildlife management. So we wanted to do these ahead of going to city council with this wildlife feeding ordinance so that everybody was keyed in on why we're trying to do this. So we wanted to do a lot of education up front before a feeding ordinance was passed so that folks understood the reasoning of why this was being done, and not just the city being overburdening and impacts, the water quality impacts, the traffic accidents, the animal health, on why that we're doing this ordinance. So in September 2018, our city council did pass an ordinance that prohibited feeding of all wildlife within the city. That ordinance became effective in March of 2019. So you'll see that there's a 6-month period in between when that ordinance was passed and when it came into effect. So that's 6 months education on the ordinance before it came into effect. So the ordinance prohibits feeding of wildlife on public and private properties. So not just city parks and city park properties, but even residential or private properties throughout the city. In our ordinance, we have the first offense as being a warning, with the second and following offenses with issuance of fines between $75 and $500. Bird feeders that are hung at least 5 feet high, and that height is really just so it's out of reach from deer and ducks or other terrestrial animals. And there was also an exception for hunting land permits, as there were a few properties within the city limits that were still large enough to legally allow hunting, and those folks can get permits through our police department to actually still do hunting. And that was there was just a in our ordinance so that folks that were still hunting on their properties could still feed wildlife or deer for the purposes of hunting. The feeding ordinance is largely enforced by city park rangers. So the park rangers within all the city parks, they are enforcing on our parklands. And then the feeding ordinance, and primarily in residential areas where it's mainly white-tailed deer feeding, our animal control officers and code compliance officers are.
So I think I covered the wildlife feeding ordinance. The slide basically shows, what we included in that feeding ordinance. If anybody would like a copy of our feeding ordinance, my contact information will be at the end of this presentation. So feel free to reach out to me and I can give you a copy of that feeding ordinance. The feeding ordinance was reviewed by Texas Parks and Wildlife, our main point of contact. So just to allow them any content or comment into the feeding ordinance. So that's something that, Rachel may be able to help individual jurisdictions out with. Right, so once we got the feeding ordinance in place, we used some grant funding that we had through a Watershed Protection Plan grant through the TCEQ and the EPA to produce and install signage. There's 3 sign types that we ended up with. The sign to the left on the slide is basically a 12 by 18. It's the size of a common traffic sign, and so we have these up at several locations throughout our park where feeding was prominent. The smaller sign in the middle was about 6 inches by 6 inches, and we basically use this as a placard on top of picnic tables in our park areas. So basically 1 out of every 2 or 3 park benches or picnic tables in the park, we put these as a placard on top of that, just as a reminder to folks that are eating lunch at a picnic table not to throw out their food to the wildlife. And then the third sign that we installed was a larger, more kiosk style sign that we had posted up at 2 or 3 locations in a park in New Braunfels where feeding was prominent. And that included some information about, the negative impacts of feeding wildlife. So as Rachel had mentioned earlier, we have one park, Land Park, that's immediately along Land Lake and the Como River where we have a bacteria impairment. And so Feeding was very prolific there. Again, Rachel said that most people do this and go out and feed thinking there's no harm done. It's been going on for years and years. I think when I was a kid, I was out there feeding ducks. And again, a lot of children out there feeding ducks. So we wanted to include educational signage in that park to inform folks of the ordinance. And again, the first offense of the ordinance is a warning. So we equipped our park rangers and our animal control services with a lot of education and outreach materials, and the education that they needed to basically, when they met with residents or folks that were feeding, to inform them of the negative impact, so that they're not just slapping them with a ticket or something like that. They're actually giving them the information they need on why the ordinance is in place and why there's negative impacts to feeding wildlife. So one avian waterfowl or wild waterfowl management strategy, or actually two, have been: one is the trapping and removal of non-native waterfowl from land of park. So we've been doing this since 2018, and since then we have trapped about 150 non-native waterfowl from land to park. I would say about 90% of the non-native waterfowl are the Egyptian geese, which you'll see in the middle photo on the slide here. And we have been trapping, and some of those Egyptian geese have been relocated to private ranches. The trapper that actually we consulted with to do the trapping, he takes them to his property and he clips the wings regularly of those waterfowl. So they have a home there with him. The Muscovy ducks, which is another non-native duck that we capture, those have to be euthanized, and it's my understanding that there's a federal law that protects or actually requires those Muscovy ducks to be euthanized, so that you're not trapping and relocating and causing a invasive species problem elsewhere where you relocate those Muscovy ducks. So again, we've been doing the trapping primarily in the off season at the park, so mainly from November to March, when there's not as many folks in the park. Of course, we want to try to not cause alarm to folks, and try to do it when there's least amount of folks in the park, so folks aren't witnessing what we're doing. You'll see the photo on the right is it's basically a large box trap that our consultant is setting up. We have two of these traps in the park. The gates on either end are operated by a remote control switch. So we'll go into these traps. We'll lay out typically bread or chicken scratch in the bottom of the trap, and then we'll give it about 5 or 10 minutes. The non-native waterfowl will go into the trap, and then we will remotely shut the gate, and then we'll throw a tarp underneath the top of the trap to make it dark in there. One, so folks aren't seeing us grabbing the waterfowl, but two, it helps to calm the animals. So our trapper will go inside the trap with large plastic totes, and they will place the trapped waterfowl in each of the totes that has holes in it, and they will take that to their trailer. I will say that I've observed all the trappings, and it is done very humanely. There's not a whole lot of struggle with the animals. So it's done very humanely and cautiously, just for folks that may be concerned about that. And certainly we were with folks, witnessing the trapping, folks that might be in the park. So we wanted to try to keep that to a minimum and make sure that everything was done up to par without serious concern. We have also done, since 2018, the non-native waterfowl egg coding. So Rachel talked a little bit about this. So we basically hire a biologist and a consultant that goes through, that's able to discern native from non-native waterfowl eggs, and they go and they coat these eggs with a food grade oil, basically just corn oil, and coat these eggs so that they will not hatch and produce a viable offspring. Aside from the active, the active management, trapping and egg coating, we have done a whole lot of education and outreach. A lot of this is funded through our water quality grant through TCEQ and EPA. But when the ordinance first came to be, when it was being presented to the public through workshops, it presented to City Council. Certainly the local media and newspapers were interested in the story and the ordinance, so we worked very closely with our local newspapers and media to make sure that they were, I guess, publishing articles that had the correct information. So again, I think that's an important tip going forward for anybody looking to do an ordinance, is working with your media, making sure that they have the information to get out to folks on why the ordinance, is being put forth, and certainly focusing on those negative impacts of wildlife feeding. And so we also paid the newspapers further down the line. When we were doing the ordinance, there was a lot of interest from the newspapers, so they basically ran these stories, free of charge. A little further down the line, we were paying for newspaper space to publish articles about the feeding ordinance and the negative impacts of wildlife feeding, as well as just general, water quality concerns. What is a watershed? How does, how can wildlife feeding impact water quality? So we did a whole lot with the newspapers on publications on what we're doing through our watershed protection plan and how we're trying to combat bacteria loading. We also had several news stations that were interested in the ordinance that we had interviews with that did news station feeds. So again, plugging those folks with the information, about what are the negative impacts of wildlife feeding. Then we had, both before and after the ordinance went into effect, we worked very closely with Parks and Wildlife and held wildlife management workshops for the public. I believe we held 3 of these. And I'll say that, the presentations that were given were very similar to the presentations that Rachel gave earlier. And I think it's very valuable to have, a representative from Parks and Wildlife to speak to the public, because they typically are the trusted authority for, wildlife management in Texas. So, certainly city staff sometimes has weight, to throw around, and folks, trust things that the city staff is putting out there. But of course, having that authority from Texas Parks and Wildlife, folks really trusted what they were saying and believed that, something needed to be done about managing our wildlife. And we also used Turning Point technology at those workshops, which allowed folks to basically pull in their thoughts about wildlife management, whether it's a feeding ordinance or whether, questions like, should the city do active management of wildlife? So folks were able to be asked a question at those workshops and then basically pull in their answers to questions that were given. And then those results were basically presented on a display screen so that folks could see how other folks were thinking and how they were polling in their thoughts about wildlife management. So I think that was a great tool that we used at those wildlife management workshops. And then we also, in general, with our watershed protection plan and wildlife management efforts, we do an annual summary and an infographic, basically just summarizing all the activities, and we basically distribute that out to elected officials and members of the public, and as well as our watershed protection plan stakeholder groups, so that they have the latest and greatest information about what's been going on with wildlife management. We also produced educational postcards and door hangers. So I have a couple of examples of these. The wildlife feeding postcard, we did a large mail out so that information got out to the public via mail. We also hand both of these postcards and door hangers. Well, I guess the postcards we hand out mainly to our park rangers. So when they run into folks that are feeding wildlife in the park, they can give them some information about the ordinance. And I don't have it shown here, but on the back of that postcard is a lot of information on the negative impacts of wildlife feeding. The door hangers are mainly used in residential areas for folks that are feeding white-tailed deer, usually in their front yard or sometimes in their backyard. So if we get a complaint from somebody saying, hey, my neighbor's feeding white-tailed deer, our animal control officers can go and talk to the folks who are feeding, and if they're not available, they can leave this door hanger on their door. Again, that states that there is an ordinance against feeding, and then again on the back of this door hanger, it has information on the negative impacts of feeding and why wildlife feeding is not good for the animals, for water quality, traffic accidents, things like that. We're also working on an educational video right now. The educational video is really to support our watershed protection plan goals and objectives. But, again, a key component of our watershed protection plan is wildlife feeding. So this educational video we're working on right now. We're about to have it finalized, but this is a It's a 4-minute video that talks a lot about what a watershed is, how stormwater runoff works, and how pollutant sources such as excrement from wildlife can impact local waterways. So there's a lot in there about general watershed management and stormwater pollution, but then a lot in there about the wildlife feeding ordinance and the negative impacts on wildlife feeding. So once we have this video completed, we're looking to air it in our local news theaters or our local movie theaters when the movie theaters do get back into action. And we'll have it basically as a preview ad in front of movies at several theaters here in and around New Braunfels. We'll also use the video and post it on our city WPP, our Watershed Protection Plan website, and then also in several city facilities. We're also looking at doing a condensed version of the video, about a 1 to 2 minute snippet of the video that we'll use on the city's Facebook page and other social media platforms. So again, here, just looking for every avenue that we can to try to get the word out about, one, our bacteria issue, the Watershed Protection Plan, but also the key message about wildlife feeding and why it's important not to feed wildlife. Great. We're also doing a lot of education outreach to our local school districts and school kids. Not so much anymore, with COVID concerns, but before kind of the virus started to spread, we were getting out into our local schools and doing education for a lot of different age kids. And again, I think when we were developing our messaging and our program for the Watershed Protection Plan and the feeding ordinance, we knew that it was an important thing to get out to the kids so that kids could understand and maybe inform their parents on why it's bad to feed wildlife. My boss, who used to work for TxDOT, said that it was similar to the campaign that TxDOT did with, buckling your seatbelt campaign. It was aimed at school-age kids and children so that they could learn the messaging and then again kind of bring that up to their parents rather than the parents learning and again kind of pushing that down to the kids. So a lot of education with the school districts, and we've got some great contacts with the school districts and are mainly plugging this in through science curriculum. We can kind of look at it from a hydrology, watershed management standpoint to where we can talk about stormwater runoff and then tie in wildlife feeding into that message. Again, we worked with several school districts so that we can also do training for the teachers who are, mainly science teachers, so that we could give them curriculum about watershed education and the feeding ordinances that they could use that in their daily lesson plans. And then we also do a good amount of education at community events where we talk to folks about the Watershed Protection Plan and then also about, again, the negative impacts of wildlife feeding and the wildlife feeding ordinance. Great, and I believe that's all I have for you today. Here's my contact information. Again, if anybody out there would like a copy of the city's ordinance or copies of any of the educational materials that we've put out, the signage or the educational handouts, please feel free to give me an email and I'll send that right over to you so that you can use that as an example if wildlife management is something that you're looking to pursue. And you could also feel free to call me. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Thanks, Mark. It looks like we have one question already, and it's about what percentage of the city of New Braunfels is rural area versus urban area?
I guess the city now, I'd say it's about 90% urbanized, with some areas on the fringes that are still a little more rural, but I'd say about 90% is urbanized. We certainly have within that urbanized area, there's certainly a lot of neighborhoods that, are on larger acreage properties. So, 1/2 to 1 acre properties where there's a lot of white-tailed deer in those neighborhoods. So I would still consider those areas urbanized, but still have kind of a natural aesthetic that do provide habitat for deer and dogs.
Great. I have another question. Did New Braunfels do bacteria source tracking prior to the ordinance?
We did, and I didn't mention that in my presentation, but we did bacteria source tracking in 2013 and 2016 ahead of the ordinance. So when we did that bacteria source tracking, that came back 60 to 70% of the wildlife or the bacteria contributions being from wildlife. So we used that information as we developed our watershed protection plan and put together our bacteria loading mitigation strategy with a prioritization on wildlife management, since that did show up is a main contributor of bacteria in the bacteria source tracking. The bacteria source tracking also was very helpful to be able to show members of the community, city council, elected officials, where the contributions were coming from. Without that, it would be difficult to go in and say, hey, we have a bacteria problem. We know the bacteria levels are high, but we don't know where the bacteria is coming from. I feel that if we would have gone forward just with that approach and not had the bacteria source tracking data, folks would have really questioned whether waterfowl and wildlife was a main contributor. But with having that BST data available, I think it did give that a lot of weight. And folks were able to kind of realize that wildlife was a problem as far as water quality. So it gave a lot of weight on trying to push forward the feeding ordinance. And we did our BST tracking with Dr. Terry Gentry at Texas A&M, and he even came down and presented to our city council on the results from their BST analysis.
Great. I have a follow-up statement to that it would be very interesting to see what the breakdown would be using BST following the work. And then I have another question. How much was the grant from TCQ and EPA, and how much was spent on the project in total?
So we've got a couple separate grants from TCEQ and EPA. We got about, I can't remember exactly, it was about $250,000 for the development of our watershed protection plan. And then we recently got a grant for $440,000 for the first 3 years of implementation of our watershed protection plan. Right now, we've gone through about half of our implementation budget, and we're on coming to the close of year 2. And I would say about 50% of that budget, maybe 40 to 50% of that budget is spent on wildlife management and education outreach around wildlife management. I will note that as far as the waterfowl trapping that we're doing, the grant would not pay for that work, since there was I think a requirement from the federal level that the funds couldn't be used for the trapping. So that's paid out of the city budget.
Great, thank you. And then I have one other question. Was there much pushback from the residents that live in the country and want to feed the animals?
There certainly was a lot of pushback as we teed up the ordinance and started going out to city council and the public with the proposed ordinance. And I would say, with most of the folks, that live in the city, it is urbanized area. Again, there are those outliers, that are kind of out in the country. I would say a lot of the pushback came from folks living in residential neighborhoods that live on, larger lots, that were accustomed to feeding deer in their front yard, on a daily basis. And that's certainly a problem. So a lot of the pushback came from those folks, and they came, saying, hey, these deer need to be fed. I can see how skinny they are. They need help through the summer, because the grass isn't there. We're kind of in a drought. And so I think that's when it was real important to have Texas Parks and Wildlife there to kind of help provide solid answers, technical, responses to folks that had, pushback on, hey, these deer need help on surviving. And it was like, no, that the food sources are out there. They just have to roam and forage more to find the food sources and basically disperse. And I think that was the message that we gave to folks.
All right. One more question. Is there a noticeable impact on the bacterial levels after the implementation of this program, or is it still too early to tell?
Sure. I would say it's still too early to tell. The bacteria results that we have been getting we were seeing increasing trends. Now it seems like they have tapered off, at least over the couple of years. But there's certainly a lot of different variables that play into those bacteria contributions. And I would say at this point, it's still too early to tell if what we're doing is having an impact. Certainly the trapping and egg coating have a pretty quick, direct effect on the populations. So that's definitely, providing a noticeable reduction in, waste material or excrement that we see on, sidewalks into our parks, and certainly would have an impact on bacteria loading. The feeding ordinance, with just going in place about a year ago, I would say that really hasn't had an effect on populations just yet, as it's going to still take some time for basically animals to begin dispersing, for those food sources to not be, readily available. And certainly we still have folks feeding in our parks and in neighborhood. It's still happening. So we're still working on it with education, and then also, enforcement of our feeding ordinance.
Thank you, Mark. It doesn't look like we have any questions coming in at the moment, but we'll give everyone a final chance at the very end. So we do have some available resources from NCTCOG that the TMDL Stormwater Subcommittee sponsored as their project for previous years. We have template signs, a social media toolkit, template flyers and brochures that you can hand out or post. These resources are available for download and use on the TMDL webpage under the resources banner. So that's the same link that the TMDL iPlan will be available on. At this point, I will open it up for any final questions. Here is COG's contact information if y'all have any burning questions or suggestions for future webinar or workshop topics. And with that, this webinar is now over. Thank you again for everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate the presentations from Rachel and Mark, and hope that we'll get to see all of y'all very soon.